Every hospital has its difficult cases, its hallway secrets, and that one doctor no one dares to challenge. The problem is, what happens when the most dedicated resident of them all realizes far too soon that her greatest weakness will not be the pressure of the job, but the cold, admired, ridiculously attractive chief who seems determined to drive her insane. The double doors of St. Andrew's Regional Hospital opened at exactly 7 in the morning, and 12 new residents walked through them in a tight, nervous cluster. Some carried coffee cups like shields, others clutched folders against their chests. All of them wore brand new white coats that still smelled of plastic packaging and ambition. Abigail Coleman was somewhere in the middle of the group, trying to disappear. Her fingers pressed against the side of her coat, a habit she had developed during exams. Tiny movements no one would notice unless they were looking. She wasn't cold. She wasn't unprepared. She had studied for this moment her entire life, sacrificed every weekend, every holiday, every distraction that might have pulled her away from the one thing she wanted. Medical school had been her oxygen. Residency was the next breath. But her hands would not stop trembling. She had seen the name on the welcome letter. Dr. James Smith, Chief of Medical Staff, would be personally conducting the orientation for the incoming class. She knew who he was. Everyone did. She had attended 3 of his lectures during her final year, sat in the back row, notebook open, pen moving fast, heart doing something she refused to name. He explained complex cases the way other people told stories. He made medicine feel alive, urgent, sacred. She admired him the way she admired a cathedral, from a distance with reverence, knowing she would never get close enough to touch the stone. And now he was walking toward the group. He came through a side corridor with long, deliberate strides, tall, broad shoulders that filled the coat without trying, a jaw that looked like it had been carved for the specific purpose of making people pay attention. His dark hair was cut short, practical, and his eyes swept the group the way a general surveys a formation, measuring, cataloguing, deciding. "Good morning." His voice carried without effort, low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. "Welcome to St. Andrews. Over the next 12 months, this hospital will teach you more than 4 years of medical school ever could. Some of you will rise to it. Some of you won't. That's not cruelty. It's honesty. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion." Abigail's heart was hammering so hard, she was certain the resident next to her could hear it. She focused on breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The same technique she used before oral exams, before presentations, before every moment that demanded she be steady when everything inside her was shaking. He began walking, and the group followed. The tour moved through the emergency department, the surgical wing, the ICU. He explained protocols with precision, pointed out stations and safety equipment, introduced senior staff along the way. His tone was professional, clipped, efficient. He wasted no words. Then his eyes passed over her. It was brief, a fraction of a second longer than necessary. His gaze moved across the group and caught on her face the way a sleeve catches on a nail, an interruption so small it might have been imagined. He looked away immediately, refocused on the corridor ahead, and continued talking about the electronic charting system, but his left hand closed into a fist at his side. He didn't finish the thought. He refused to finish it. She was a resident, 24, maybe 25, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, and eyes that watched everything with a quiet intensity he recognized. She was paying attention, not the anxious, scattered attention of someone trying to memorize details, but the deep, hungry attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He pushed the thought away, like shoving a drawer shut. Halfway through the tour, he stopped in front of the radiology department and turned to face the group. "Let's see what you actually know." He described a case, a 58-year-old male presenting with acute chest pain, elevated troponin, but a normal ECG. "What's your differential? And don't give me the textbook answer. Give me the answer you'd stake a patient's life on." Silence. 12 residents stared at him. Some looked at the floor. Others glanced sideways, hoping someone else would volunteer. Abigail raised her hand. He nodded. She began speaking. Her voice was clear at first, controlled. Given the elevated troponin with a normal ECG, I'd consider a type 2 myocardial infarction secondary to demand ischemia. But I'd also want to rule out myocarditis, especially if there's a recent history of... He turned his full attention to her. It hit her like a wall. Those eyes, dark, focused, impossibly direct, locked onto hers with a weight that pressed against her chest. He wasn't just listening. He was studying her. Every word, every breath, every micro-expression. Her mind went blank. The sentence she had been building collapsed, the words scattered like papers blown off a desk, and no matter how desperately she reached for them, they were gone. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. The silence stretched. She felt heat crawling up her neck, spreading across her cheeks, and the more aware she became of it, the worse it got. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry, If you're going to answer," he said, his voice cold and flat, "then finish the answer." The words landed like a slap. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. He held her gaze for one more second, one brutal, endless second, then turned away and resumed walking as if nothing had happened. "Moving on." Abigail stood frozen while the group shuffled past her. One by one, white coats brushed her shoulders as the other residents followed him down the corridor. She waited until the last one passed, then quietly moved to the back of the line, pressing herself against the far wall as far from him as the hallway would allow. He noticed, and something twisted in his stomach, a sharp, sour feeling he identified immediately as guilt. He had been too harsh. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. But the alternative had been worse. The alternative had been standing there, looking at her, feeling his skin prickle with something entirely inappropriate, and doing nothing about it. So he had been cruel instead. The tour ended 40 minutes later. He dismissed the group with instructions to report to their assigned departments by noon. The residents scattered in different directions, clutching their schedules, whispering to each other. Abigail walked calmly until she found an empty supply closet near the stairwell on the second floor. She stepped inside, closed the door, leaned against a shelf stacked with gauze and saline bags, and pressed both hands over her mouth. The tears came fast and hot. She cried without sound. Years of practice had taught her that, letting the humiliation and the frustration drain out of her in waves. The shelf dug into her back. The closet smelled like antiseptic and cardboard. 3 minutes. She gave herself exactly 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, straightened her coat, and looked at the closed door in front of her. "You are not quitting," she said out loud. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "And you are not letting him break you." She opened the door and walked out. Room 412 smelled like wilting chrysanthemums and industrial soap. The patient, a 71-year-old woman named Dorothy, had been admitted 3 days earlier with pneumonia that wasn't responding to the first round of antibiotics. Her chart was a mess of lab results and conflicting notes from the overnight team, and Abigail had spent 20 minutes untangling it before stepping through the door. Dorothy was sitting up in bed, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, working a crossword puzzle with a pencil that had been sharpened down to a stub. 7-letter word for stubborn, Dorothy said without looking up. Starts with a D. Defiant, Abigail offered. Dorothy wrote it in. You're smarter than the last one they sent. He just stood there looking at his phone. Abigail smiled and pulled a chair closer to the bed. She explained what the new blood work showed, what changes they were making to the medication, and what Dorothy could expect over the next 48 hours. She spoke slowly, clearly, without jargon, and when Dorothy asked if the pneumonia could come back after she went home, Abigail didn't give her a statistic. She gave her a plan. We're going to make sure you leave here stronger than when you came in, Abigail said, and I'll write everything down for your daughter so she knows exactly what to watch for. Dorothy reached over and squeezed her hand. Her fingers were thin and cool, the skin papery. You're a good one, sweetheart. Don't let this place harden you. Abigail squeezed back. She didn't know that James was standing in the corridor outside the room, reading a chart that he had already finished reading 2 minutes ago. He had heard every word. The way she spoke to the patient, unhurried, warm, genuinely present, reminded him of why he had chosen medicine in the first place. Before the administrative wait, before the politics, before the endless pressure to perform and produce and publish. She sounded like someone who still believed the whole point was the person in the bed. He walked away before she came out. That first week moved in a blur of 12-hour shifts, new protocols, and the particular exhaustion that comes from learning an entire system while trying not to make a single mistake. Abigail threw herself into every rotation with a focus that bordered on obsessive. She arrived early, stayed late, read case studies on the bus home, fell asleep with her tablet open on her chest. But she watched him. She couldn't help it. Even with the sting of his words still fresh, even with the deliberate distance she kept between them, her eyes found him in every room he entered. She watched him with patience, and what she saw confused her deeply. On Tuesday, she saw him sit on the edge of a bed and hold the hand of a man who had just been told his wife's surgery would be longer than expected. He didn't say anything profound. He just said, "She's in good hands, Frank, the best hands in the building." And Frank believed him because there was something in James's voice and a low, steady certainty that made fear feel manageable. On Wednesday, she watched him examine a 6-year-old girl with a broken arm. He knelt down to her level, pointed at the X-ray, and told her that her bone looked like a lightning bolt, which meant she was basically a superhero. The girl laughed through her tears. He winked at the mother, who mouthed a silent thank you. On Thursday, she overheard him on the phone with an insurance company, fighting for a patient's medication coverage. His voice was ice, controlled fury. He cited policy numbers from memory and didn't hang up until he got the approval. The contradiction fascinated her. With residents, he was granite, cold, demanding, unforgiving of hesitation. With patients, he became someone else entirely, someone whose eyes softened, whose voice dropped into a register that felt like a hand on your shoulder. Two different men living inside the same white coat, and Abigail couldn't stop trying to figure out which one was real. Both, she suspected. Both. And that was the problem. Friday afternoon found her in his office for the first time since the tour. He had called in all the first-year residents individually to review their initial case documentation. When her turn came, she knocked twice and entered with her shoulders back and her jaw set, armor she had been assembling all week. He was behind his desk, reading something on his computer. The office was organized with military precision, files stacked in neat rows, pens arranged by color in a ceramic cup, a single framed photograph on the bookshelf that she couldn't see clearly from the doorway. The room smelled faintly of coffee and something else, something warm and clean like fresh linen dried in sunlight. "Sit down, Coleman." She sat, hands flat on her thighs, back straight. He turned the monitor toward her. "Your notes on the Henderson case. Walk me through your reasoning for the differential." She did, clearly, concisely, without a single tremor in her voice. She had rehearsed this in her apartment the night before, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, speaking to her own reflection, until the words felt solid. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pointed to something on the screen. "This lab value. You flagged it, but didn't explain why. I noticed an inconsistency between the CBC and the metabolic panel. The potassium was borderline, but combined with the patient's medication history. Show me." He scooted his chair to the side, making room for her to see the screen more closely. She stood, leaned in, and began pointing out the numbers. Her focus was entirely on the data. Her index finger traced a line across the monitor, and she explained the correlation she had noticed between two values that the attending had missed. She didn't realize how close she was. Her shoulder was nearly touching his. Her hair, pulled back in a low ponytail, a strand loose near her temple, was inches from his face. He could smell something faint and clean. Soap, maybe, or shampoo. Something that had no business being this distracting. He stopped listening to the words. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in the air, a stillness that hadn't been there a moment ago. She turned her head and found his eyes already on her. Not on the screen. On her. Close. Too close. His gaze dropped to her mouth, just for a heartbeat. A single, reckless heartbeat. He cleared his throat. She straightened up and took a full step backward, her pulse slamming against her ribs. The back of her neck was burning. "Good catch on the potassium," he said. His voice was perfectly even, perfectly controlled, as if nothing had happened. "Make sure you document the reasoning next time, not just the flag." "Yes, Dr. Smith." "That's all." She left. Her legs carried her down the corridor on autopilot, while her mind replayed those 2 seconds on an endless loop. The way his eyes had changed, the way the air between them had thickened into something she could almost taste, the way he had looked at her mouth, as if he were reading a sentence he wanted to memorize. She pressed her back against the hallway wall and let out a breath she had been holding since she stood up from that chair. In his office, James sat motionless for a long time. The screen in front of him displayed lab results he was no longer reading. His hand rested on the desk, and if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed that his fingers were not entirely steady. He reached for his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Over the days that followed, Abigail proved herself in ways that were impossible to ignore. She was the first to volunteer for difficult cases and the last to complain about the hours. She stitched a laceration on a screaming toddler, with hands so gentle and so sure that the attending stood back and watched instead of taking over. She caught a medication error in a chart that 3 other people had signed off on. She stayed 40 minutes past her shift to sit with a patient who was scared to sleep alone. James noticed all of it. He noticed, and he wished he didn't. Because every time she did something remarkable, his chest did something inconvenient. A small tightening, a warmth that spread outward from a place he couldn't name. He found himself looking for her in the hallways, scanning the cafeteria for her ponytail, listening for her voice around corners. He watched her when she wasn't looking, and she watched him when he wasn't. Neither of them knew they were doing the same thing, at the same time, from opposite ends of the same corridor. 2 people circling each other like planets, caught in an orbit neither one had chosen, pulled by a gravity they both pretended didn't exist. The vending machine on the 3rd floor had been broken for 2 days, which meant the only place to get decent coffee before 6 in the morning was the nurses' station near the East Wing. Abigail learned this on her 9th day, when she arrived at 5:40 and found the hallway already humming with quiet conversations and the smell of cheap ground beans. She poured herself a cup and stood near the counter, reviewing her patient list on a crumpled printout she had folded into her pocket the night before. 2 nurses were talking a few feet away. She wasn't listening, not intentionally, until she heard his name. "Smith nearly made Richardson cry yesterday," one of them said. She was older, mid-50s maybe, with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. The kid presented a case and missed one detail, one. Smith looked at him like he'd committed a felony. The other nurse, younger with short dark hair and quick hands that were already sorting medication trays, shook her head. "That's just how he is. Brilliant but impossible. I've been here 4 years, and I've never seen him let anyone get close, not a single person. No girlfriend, no wife? Nothing, ever. He shows up, he works, he leaves. That's it. Some of the girls tried, believe me. He doesn't even notice." The older nurse lowered her voice, but not enough. "Cold as stone, that one." "Not cold," the younger one corrected. "Just locked. Like there's a door somewhere inside him, and he threw away the key a long time ago." Abigail stared at her coffee. The steam curled upward and dissolved into the fluorescent light above her head. She thought about the man who had knelt in front of a little girl with a broken arm and called her a superhero. The man who had fought an insurance company on the phone with the quiet rage of someone who took every patient's struggle personally. Locked, maybe, but not empty. She folded her printout and walked away, carrying more questions than she had arrived with. Over the next few days, the comments kept finding her. In the break room, in the elevator, whispered between shifts. Dr. Smith was a machine. Dr. Smith had no personal life. Dr. Smith once made a second-year resident redo an entire week of documentation because of a single formatting error. Dr. Smith never smiled at anyone who wasn't a patient. Each story added a new layer to the image she was building of him, and none of the layers matched. The man the hospital described and the man she observed in patient rooms were so different they could have been brothers who shared a face, but nothing else. She thought about it more than she should have. At night, in her small apartment with its second-hand couch and its window that faced a brick wall, She would sit cross-legged on the bed and think about the way his voice changed when he spoke to someone who was frightened. How it dropped half an octave, became almost soft. She thought about the moment in his office when he had looked at her mouth, and how the memory of it still made her stomach flip like a coin tossed into the air. She told herself it was admiration, professional respect, curiosity about a complex person. She almost believed it. It was a Thursday evening, late enough that most of the day staff had already gone home. Abigail had stayed to finish charting on a complicated admission. A teenager with unexplained abdominal pain, whose labs kept contradicting each other. By the time she closed her laptop, the hallways were dim and mostly empty, the hospital settling into its quieter nighttime rhythm. She needed to change before leaving. Her scrubs had a coffee stain on the left sleeve, and something she preferred not to identify on the hem. The women's locker room was on the second floor, but she sometimes used the smaller shared one near the staff entrance because it was closer to the parking lot. She pushed the door open without thinking, and stopped. James was standing in front of the metal lockers, facing away from her. He had pulled his scrub top off and was reaching for a dark shirt hanging on a hook. His back was broad, muscled in a way that spoke of discipline rather than vanity, the kind of body built by early morning runs and years of carrying tension in every fiber. A line of shadow defined his spine, and his shoulders moved with an easy, unconscious grace as he shook out the shirt. Abigail's hand was still on the door handle. Her body had forgotten how to move. He turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His chest was bare, and she could see the way it rose and fell with steady, even breathing. A thin silver chain hung around his neck. She hadn't noticed it before, hidden as it always was beneath his scrubs. His stomach was flat, defined without being sculpted, and there was a small scar just below his left collarbone that she wanted to ask about, and knew she never would. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. She was not breathing. He didn't rush to cover himself. He didn't look away. Instead, he set the shirt down on the bench beside him and walked toward her. Slowly, each step deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his skin, close enough that she could smell him, clean sweat, soap, something woody underneath that she couldn't name, but knew she would remember. He raised his right hand. His index finger and thumb found her chin, a grip so light it barely qualified as touch, and tilted her face upward until her eyes met his. "Careful where you look, Coleman." His voice was low, rough at the edges, like sandpaper dragged across velvet. There was a warning in it, but something else too, something that made her knees feel unreliable. "I'm sorry," she managed. The words came out barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you were... Go." She went. Her sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as she walked fast, not running, she would not run, down the corridor and around the corner and through the double doors that led to the stairwell. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart beating so hard it felt like it was trying to leave her body entirely. She reached the ground floor, leaned against the cool concrete wall, and pressed her hands flat against her burning cheeks. His fingers on her chin, the heat of his skin, the way his voice had dropped into something almost dangerous. She closed her eyes and replayed it, every detail, the chain around his neck, the scar below his collarbone, the way he had walked toward her without hesitation, as if proximity to her was something he had been calculating long before she opened that door. She groaned softly and pressed her forehead against the wall. This was not admiration. This was not professional respect. This was trouble. 2 floors above, James stood in the empty locker room with his shirt still on the bench and his hand still suspended in the air where her chin had been. His pulse was hammering. His jaw was tight. He could still feel the softness of her skin against his fingertips, still see the way her lips had parted when he touched her, still hear the breathless sound of her apology. He grabbed his shirt and pulled it on with more force than necessary. He had told her to be careful. He should have been telling himself. 3:17 in the morning. The cafeteria lights were set to their overnight mode, half the fixtures off, the rest dimmed to a yellowish glow that made the empty room look like a photograph left too long in the sun. The chairs were still stacked on most of the tables from the evening cleaning, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerated display case near the register. its shelves holding nothing but 2 sad-looking sandwiches and a cup of fruit salad that had seen better days. Abigail couldn't sleep. She had been on call since 6 the previous morning, caught a 2-hour nap in the residence room around midnight, and woken up with a restlessness that wouldn't let her close her eyes again. Her body was tired. Her mind was not. She walked into the cafeteria expecting emptiness. James was sitting at a table near the far window, alone. No food in front of him, no phone. Just a paper cup of something that might have been coffee, held loosely in both hands, and an expression she had never seen him wear before. He looked tired. Not the productive, sharp-edged tiredness she was used to seeing in him, the kind that made him more focused, more demanding. This was different. His shoulders were lower. His jaw was unclenched for once. He was staring at nothing, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the dark window, and there was a heaviness about him that made him look less like the chief of staff and more like a man sitting alone with something he couldn't put down. She almost turned around. Almost. But her feet carried her forward, past the empty tables, past the stacked chairs, until she was pulling a seat out across from him. The legs scraped against the floor and the sound broke whatever trance he had been in. He looked up, surprise, quick and unguarded, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Then the mask slid back into place, the composed, unreadable expression she knew so well. "Dr. Smith," she said quietly, "do you want some company?" He looked at her for a long moment. The cafeteria was so quiet she could hear the clock on the wall, a soft, mechanical ticking that seemed to count something other than seconds. She watched his hands tighten around the cup, a small movement, the kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. "I was just leaving," he said. He stood, pushed the chair back, picked up the cup that she now realized was still full. He hadn't taken a single sip. "Good night, Coleman." He walked past her, close enough that his sleeve brushed her shoulder, and the brief contact sent a current through her skin that lingered long after he was gone. She sat alone in the dim cafeteria, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. "Don't be upset," she whispered to herself. "He's your boss. That's all he is." But the butterflies in her stomach, those relentless, maddening butterflies that appeared every time she saw him, heard him, thought about him, didn't care about hospital hierarchy. They didn't care about professionalism or common sense or self-preservation. They just kept flying, chaotic and warm, as if her body knew something her mind was still refusing to accept. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, as though she could still them by force. It didn't work. The following Tuesday, something shifted. Abigail was presenting a case during morning rounds, a 42-year-old woman with recurring migraines that hadn't responded to standard treatment. She had spent 2 hours the previous night researching alternative approaches, cross-referencing studies, building a differential that went 3 layers deeper than what was expected of a first-year resident. James stood at the back of the group, arms crossed, watching. She presented without notes. Her voice was steady, her reasoning precise. She proposed a connection between the patient's migraines and an underlying autoimmune condition that had been overlooked in previous workups, and she supported the hypothesis with lab values she had personally requested and tracked over the past week. When she finished, the attending nodded slowly. "That's a solid differential, Dr. Coleman. We'll order the panel you suggested." The group moved on. Abigail exhaled and fell into step at the back of the line, already mentally reviewing what she might have missed. She didn't notice James slowing his pace until he was walking beside her. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on the corridor ahead. But his voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "That was excellent work." 4 words. 4 words that anyone else would have received with a polite nod and moved on. But this was James Smith, the man who once told a senior resident that adequate was the highest praise most people would ever deserve from him. The man whose approval was spoken of in the hospital, the way people speak of rare weather events. Something you heard about but never witnessed firsthand. Abigail turned her head to look at him, but he was already moving ahead, his long stride carrying him to the front of the group where he belonged. She stood still in the middle of the corridor while the rest of the residents flowed around her, like water around a stone. Her chest felt warm, Not the nervous, fluttering warmth she had been fighting for weeks, but something deeper, something that settled into her ribs and stayed there, glowing softly like an ember that had finally caught. He had seen her, not the stammering girl who had frozen during the tour, not the wide-eyed resident who had stared at him in the locker room. He had seen the doctor she was becoming, the one she had worked her entire life to be, and he had told her she was excellent. She replayed the word in her mind as she walked to her next rotation. Excellent. The way he had said it, low and private, a secret passed between them in a crowded hallway. He could have said it louder. He could have said it in front of the group, but he hadn't. He had waited until it was just the two of them, and he had given it to her like something valuable. Something meant only for her. She carried it with her for the rest of the day, through a complicated IV placement that took 3 attempts, through a disagreement with a pharmacy tech over a dosage calculation she knew was correct, through the exhaustion of hour 11 when her feet ached and her eyes burned, and the only thing keeping her upright was stubbornness. That evening, she sat on the edge of her bed and pulled off her shoes one at a time. Her apartment was quiet, the window was open, and a warm breeze carried the distant sound of traffic, and someone's radio playing something slow and bluesy 2 floors down. She wiggled her toes against the cold floor and let her head drop forward, stretching the tight muscles in her neck. Excellent work. She smiled. Small, private, aimed at no one. Across town, James sat in his own apartment, larger, quieter, impeccably organized, and stared at a medical journal he had been trying to read for the past 40 minutes. The same paragraph, over and over. The words slid off his brain like rain off glass. He kept thinking about the way she had presented that case, the confidence in her voice that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, the intelligence that burned behind every word, sharp and clean and undeniable. She had been remarkable, and he had told her so, and the look on her face when he said it, that brief, unguarded flash of something bright and fragile, had followed him home like a song he couldn't stop humming. He closed the journal and set it on the coffee table. This was a problem. He had spent 12 years building a career on discipline, on boundaries, on the absolute separation of personal feeling from professional responsibility. He had never once crossed that line, never been tempted, never even come close. And now a 24-year-old resident with steady hands and quiet eyes was dismantling everything he had built, and she wasn't even trying. He leaned back against the couch and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. The truly terrifying part was not that she was getting under his skin. The truly terrifying part was that he didn't want her to stop. 1 month felt like a year. 30 days of stolen glances across crowded rooms. 30 days of his voice saying her last name and her body responding before her brain had time to intervene. 30 days of learning the geography of his presence, which corridors he walked at, which hours, where he took his coffee, the exact moment each afternoon when the light from the west-facing windows caught the side of his face and turned his eyes from dark brown to something closer to amber. She knew these things the way she knew anatomy, without trying, without wanting to. The knowledge had simply moved in and made itself at home. It was a Wednesday, late afternoon. The hospital had that particular stillness that settled over it between the lunch rush and the evening admissions, a brief pause in the chaos, as if the building itself needed to catch its breath. James had asked her to come to his office to review a complicated case, a patient with overlapping symptoms that didn't fit any clean diagnosis, the kind of puzzle he liked to use as teaching moments. She knocked. He called her in. The office looked the same as always, organized, precise, smelling faintly of the coffee he drank too much of and the leather of the chair he never leaned back in. He was standing beside his desk, holding a printed lab report, already mid-thought. "Close the door," he said without looking up. "I don't want the whole floor hearing this discussion." She closed it. He began explaining the case, pointing at specific values on the paper. His voice was clinical, focused. He walked her through the patient's history, the imaging results, the conflicting blood work. She listened, asked 2 questions that made him pause and reconsider his own reasoning, and offered an observation about the medication timeline that he hadn't caught. He looked at her. There it was again. That shift. The air between them changed pressure, the way it does before a storm, not visible, but felt in the bones, in the skin, in the small hairs on the back of the neck. He was still holding the lab report. His knuckles had gone white. She was looking at his mouth. She didn't mean to. She had spent an entire month training herself not to, building a discipline around her eyes that was almost as rigid as his discipline around everything else. But his lips had moved while he was talking, and she had watched them form words, and somewhere between the third sentence and the fourth, she had stopped hearing the words entirely, and started noticing the shape of them. He stopped talking. The silence was immediate and total, as if someone had pressed mute on the entire building. No footsteps in the corridor, no phones ringing, nothing but the sound of her own breathing, which she realized had become shallow and uneven. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing in front of an open furnace. His eyes moved from hers to her mouth and stayed there. She could see the muscles in his jaw working, the effort of restraint written across his face like a sentence he was trying not to finish. She parted her lips, not intentionally. It was an instinct, a breath that needed more room, and the mint on her breath. She had chewed gum on the way to his office, a nervous habit, reached him like a whisper. Something in his expression cracked. "Don't play with danger, Coleman." His voice was rough, scraped raw, as if the words had been dragged out of him against his will. She didn't step back. She stepped closer. Her eyes were wide, honest, terrified. They were asking something she didn't have the vocabulary for, something that lived below language, in the space between heartbeats, in the electric silence that had been building between them for 30 impossible days. He let go of the paper. It fell to the floor with a sound neither of them heard. His hand shot forward, fingers threading into the hair at the base of her neck, gripping with a hunger he had been burying for weeks. He pulled her toward him and pressed his mouth against hers. The world ended, or began. She couldn't tell. His lips were warm and firm and demanding. He kissed her like a man who had been holding his breath for a month and had finally been allowed to inhale. There was nothing gentle about it, nothing cautious or exploratory. He kissed her with the full weight of everything he had been denying, and she felt it pour into her like heat through an open window. She had never been kissed before. She had imagined it, in the private hours of the night, in the quiet spaces between textbook chapters and clinical rotations. She had wondered what it would feel like, the pressure, the warmth, the closeness of another person's breath mixing with her own. But she had never imagined this. She had never imagined that a kiss could feel like falling and flying at the same time, like gravity reversed and then doubled, like every nerve in her body had been sleeping her whole life, and just woke up all at once. He pushed her backward until her shoulders met the wall. The surface was cool against her back, a sharp, grounding contrast to the heat of his body pressed against her front. His chest was solid, immovable, and she could feel his heart beating through the fabric of his coat. Fast, as fast as hers. His mouth moved against hers with a rhythm that was both desperate and deliberate. When she ran out of air, he didn't pull away. He dragged his lips down the side of her neck, his breath hot and unsteady against her skin, his teeth grazing the sensitive spot below her ear. She made a sound, small, involuntary, something between a gasp and a sigh, and he groaned low in his throat and returned to her mouth with renewed hunger. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had stopped being relevant. A knock on the door. They broke apart like a circuit that had been cut, both gasping, both flushed. His hand was still tangled in her hair, and her fingers were gripping the front of his coat so tightly that the fabric had wrinkled beneath them. He looked at her mouth, red, slightly swollen. The desire in his eyes was so raw, it almost frightened her. Another knock. Louder. "One moment," he called, and his voice was almost steady. Almost. He stepped back, straightened his coat, ran a hand through his hair. The transformation was remarkable. In 5 seconds he reassembled the mask so completely that anyone walking in would have seen nothing but the composed, untouchable chief of staff. "Wait a few minutes before you leave," he said quietly. He didn't look at her. If he looked at her, he would kiss her again. And if he kissed her again, no amount of knocking would stop him. He opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind him. Abigail stood alone in his office. The lab report was still on the floor. The wall behind her was still warm where her body had been. She raised her hand to her lips. They were tingling, swollen. She pressed her fingertips against them softly and felt every second of what had just happened replay beneath her touch. His hand in her hair, his chest against hers, the sound he had made when she gasped, her first kiss, and it had ruined her for anything less. Abigail waited 4 minutes. She counted each one on the clock above his bookshelf, watching the second hand crawl in circles while her heartbeat slowly returned to something resembling normal. She smoothed her hair, straightened her coat, bent down to pick up the lab report and placed it on his desk. Then she opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and nearly walked straight into Karen Mitchell. The nurse was standing 3 feet from the door, as if she had been waiting. Karen was 31, sharp-featured. With auburn hair she wore pinned back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyebrows upward into a permanent expression of mild suspicion. She had been at St. Andrews for 6 years, long enough to know every rumor, every alliance, every unspoken rule. And she had spent most of those 6 years noticing James Smith the way a moth notices a flame, from a distance that was never quite safe enough. She had tried, twice. A lingering smile after a shift change, an invitation to coffee phrased casually enough to seem harmless. Both times, he had responded with polite indifference so absolute it was almost surgical. He didn't date colleagues, he didn't date anyone as far as anyone could tell. He was a door that didn't have a handle, and eventually Karen had stopped reaching for one that wasn't there, until she started noticing how he looked at the new resident. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But Karen was built for noticing. The slight turn of his head when Abigail entered a room, the half-second delay before he looked away, the way his voice shifted by degrees when he said her name. Small things, tiny, almost invisible adjustments in a man who never adjusted for anyone. And now this girl was walking out of his office with her hair slightly disheveled and her skin doing something that made Karen's stomach tighten into a fist. Dr. Coleman. Karen's voice was bright, efficient, perfectly calibrated. What were you doing in there? Abigail's pulse spiked, but her face stayed calm. Weeks of working under James Smith had taught her something about wearing a mask. Just dropping off a report. Karen's eyes moved slowly across Abigail's face. The pale skin, always so translucently pale, was flushed pink along the jaw. But the real giveaway was her mouth. The skin around her lips was red and irritated, the unmistakable evidence of prolonged contact with someone else's face. On darker skin, it might have been invisible. On Abigail's, it was a confession written in rose. Karen smiled. Of course. Have a good evening, Doctor. Abigail nodded and walked away, her shoes clicking steadily down the corridor. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen Karen standing motionless, watching her go, with an expression that had nothing to do with friendliness and everything to do with calculation. Karen found Denise Fowler in the break room 20 minutes later. Denise was a year younger, a year less experienced, and infinitely easier to influence. She was the kind of person who absorbed other people's opinions like a sponge and repeated them as if they were her own, a useful quality in an ally. I need to tell you something, Karen said, sitting across from her with a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. She kept her voice low, her expression concerned. Not angry, never angry. Angry would look petty. Concerned looked righteous. She told Denise what she had seen, the flushed face, the reddened mouth, the closed door. She didn't mention her own feelings about James. That would weaken the narrative. Instead, she framed it as worry. Worry about the young resident being taken advantage of. Worry about the hospital's reputation. You know how he is, Karen said, stirring her tea with a slow, deliberate motion. He's done this before. Every couple of years, some girl catches his eye, and he turns on the charm, makes her feel special, takes what he wants. Then he's done and she's left picking up the pieces. It was a lie. Every word of it. James had never pursued anyone at St. Andrews. Not once in 12 years. Karen knew this, but Denise didn't. And the lie was built on a foundation of plausibility. He was attractive, powerful, private. People fill silence with stories, and the story Karen was telling was exactly the kind people wanted to believe about a man they couldn't figure out. "That poor girl," Denise murmured. "She doesn't know," Karen said, "and she won't believe it if someone tells her directly. She needs to hear it for herself." Casually. Like it's common knowledge. Denise looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. They planned it for the following evening. Abigail was in the women's bathroom on the 4th floor, standing at the sink, washing her hands. The day had been long, an emergency admission, 2 procedure assists, a difficult conversation with a patient's family. She was tired in a way that went past her muscles and into her bones. The door opened. 2 voices entered mid-conversation, already loud, already filling the tiled room with an ease that suggested they didn't know, or didn't care, that someone else was there. "I'm telling you," the first voice said. Karen's, though Abigail didn't know her name well enough to place it immediately. "He's been through half the nurses on the 3rd floor. That's not even an exaggeration." Half. The second voice, Denise's, carried the perfect amount of rehearsed shock. At least. "He's smooth about it, I'll give him that. Makes each one feel like she's the only one, like it's this big forbidden thing." And then a snap of fingers. Gone. He won't even look at them the next day. It's like they never existed. Abigail's hands were still under the water. The faucet was running, but she had stopped moving. Jen from radiology. Remember her? She transferred to Mercy General because she couldn't stand seeing him every day after he dropped her. And Lisa from the NICU, same thing. He took what he wanted and moved on like it was nothing. That's awful. That's who he is. Brilliant doctor. Terrible man. The voices faded as the bathroom door swung shut behind them. Abigail turned off the faucet. Her hands were shaking. Not the fine nervous tremor she was used to. This was deeper, coming from somewhere in her chest, radiating outward through her arms and into her fingers. She gripped the edge of the sink and stared at her reflection. The fluorescent light was brutal and honest, and the face staring back at her looked exactly the way she felt. Young, pale, and completely out of her depth. She thought about the kiss, his hand in her hair, the hunger in his mouth, the way he had pressed her against the wall as if the distance between them was physically painful. And then she thought about Jen from radiology, and Lisa from the NICU and all the women on the 3rd floor, and the picture those names painted was so different from the kiss that the 2 realities couldn't coexist in the same mind without something breaking. Something broke. She dried her hands slowly, mechanically, folded the paper towel into a neat square, a small act of control in a moment where everything felt like chaos, and dropped it in the trash. She went home that night and sat on her kitchen floor because the couch felt too far away. She ate half a granola bar and drank a glass of water and stared at the wall for a long time. She was in love with him. She knew that now. The word she had been avoiding, the feeling she had been calling admiration and curiosity and professional respect, it had a name, and the name was love, and it was the most inconvenient, terrifying, beautiful thing she had ever felt. But she would not be a name on a list. She would not be a story whispered in bathrooms. She had given him her first kiss, her very first, and if that was all it meant to him, then she needed to know now, before she gave him anything else. The next morning, she arrived at the hospital with a new kind of armor, not the nervous composure she had worn during her first weeks, but something harder, colder. A wall built overnight from hurt and pride, and the fierce, stubborn refusal to let anyone see her bleed. She stopped looking at him. When he spoke to her, she answered in short, clinical sentences. "Yes, doctor." "No, doctor. The labs are on your desk, doctor." She kept her eyes on charts, on patients, on the floor, anywhere but his face. She excused herself from rooms when his presence wasn't strictly required for her work. She positioned herself at the opposite end of every group, the farthest chair in every meeting. Days passed. 3, 4, 5. Each one a little harder than the last, because the butterflies didn't care about her armor. They were still there, fluttering madly every time she heard his footsteps, or caught the scent of his coffee in a corridor she had just walked through. Her body was in open rebellion against her decision, and winning the war required an exhausting amount of willpower she wasn't sure she could sustain. By the end of the week, she had dark circles under her eyes. She was eating less, sleeping badly, and speaking to no one unless the conversation was about a patient. The other residents noticed. They didn't ask. James noticed too. He noticed everything. By Friday, he couldn't take it anymore. 7 days of watching her move through the hospital like a ghost wearing her face. 7 days of clipped answers and averted eyes, and the careful surgical way she removed herself from any room he entered. She was there, but she wasn't. The warmth that defined her, the quality that made patients trust her and colleagues gravitate toward her, had been replaced by something cold and brittle, like ice over deep water. He told himself it was guilt. She regretted the kiss. She had been caught up in a moment, and now she was ashamed, and the distance was her way of restoring the boundaries he should never have crossed. It was the rational explanation, the clean one, but her eyes told a different story. In the rare, unguarded moments when she forgot to look away fast enough, he caught something in them that wasn't shame. It was hurt. Coleman. He stopped her in the hallway after rounds, his voice neutral enough for anyone passing by. My office. 5 minutes. She nodded without expression and walked away. He was leaning against the front edge of his desk when she came in, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching her the way he watched everything, with an attention so focused it left no room for anything else. She closed the door behind her and stood near it, keeping the full length of the room between them. Her arms hung at her sides. Her chin was up. "You've been different this week," he said. "Distant, cold. I need to know why." "It's nothing, just tired." His eyes narrowed. He knew what her tired looked like. He had catalogued it across dozens of shifts. The way her blinks slowed and her ponytail drooped a quarter-inch lower on the back of her head. This wasn't tired. He uncrossed his arms and walked toward her. She didn't move. Her breathing changed, faster, shallower, but her feet stayed planted. He stopped in front of her. Close. Close enough to see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, and the way her lower lip trembled once before she pressed her teeth into it to make it stop. He lifted her chin with 2 fingers. Gentle. So different from the command in his voice. "Tell me." She looked up at him, and for a moment her armor cracked. She could see his mouth, inches from hers, and the memories hit her like a wave. His lips, his hands, the wall against her back, the sound he made against her neck. Her body remembered everything, every single detail. He saw it, the desire. It flashed across her face like lightning, there and gone but unmistakable. He kissed her. Not like before. Before had been an explosion, sudden and consuming. This was a confession. His mouth found hers with aching slowness, as if he needed her to understand that he had spent 7 days starving for exactly this. His hands cradled her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and the tenderness of the gesture nearly undid her. She kissed him back, immediately, without hesitation. Every resolution she had made on her kitchen floor dissolved the moment his lips touched hers, and she didn't care. She didn't care about the list or the names or the stories in the bathroom. She cared about this. About him. About the way his heart was pounding against her chest and the way his breath shook when she pressed closer. He walked her backward until his legs hit the armchair behind him. He sat down and pulled her onto his lap, one knee on either side of his hips. The kiss deepened. His fingers tangled in her hair, tilting her head to find a better angle, and she felt the groan that rumbled through his chest before she heard it. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her hips against his. The contact sent a shock through both of them that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with the weeks of silence and distance, and wanting that had built up like pressure in a sealed room. He kissed her neck, open-mouthed, urgent, tasting the skin below her ear while she gasped and gripped his shoulders, then back to her mouth, swallowing the small sounds she couldn't control. His hand moved beneath the hem of her scrub top, fingertips tracing up her spine with deliberate slowness, warm against her bare skin. She pulled back. Not far, just enough to speak. "I need to tell you something." Her voice was breathless, unsteady. The words stumbled over each other. I haven't, She swallowed hard. "I'm a virgin." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. His hands froze against her back. His eyes widened. His lips, still wet from hers, parted, but no sound came out. She watched the surprise transform his face, followed by something she couldn't read, something that looked like realization, then calculation, then a slow, terrible clarity. And she felt the exact moment he began to pull away. His hands left her skin as if it had burned him. "Get up." His voice was quiet, but the warmth was gone, completely, like a furnace that someone had switched off with a single, decisive click. She didn't move. Her knees were still on either side of his hips, her fingers still gripping the fabric of his coat, and her mind was trying to catch up with what was happening, because 3 seconds ago he had been kissing her like she was the only source of oxygen in the room. Abigail. First time he used her name. It should have meant something. Instead, it sounded like an apology that hadn't found its words yet. "Get up, please." She climbed off his lap. Her legs felt hollow. She stood in front of him while he rose from the chair and took 2 deliberate steps backward, creating distance the way a surgeon creates a sterile field, precise, intentional, necessary. "This was a mistake," he said. 3 words, each one a blade. He ran a hand through his hair, and she noticed that his fingers were trembling. He noticed too, and shoved his hand into his coat pocket. "You're my resident. I'm your supervisor. You're 12 years younger than me, and you're—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "We can't do this. A relationship between us would compromise everything. Your career, my reputation, the work we both—" "I understand." Her voice was ice, clean, sharp, flawless ice that covered a depth of pain she refused to let him see. The nurse's words echoed in her mind like a recording set on loop. He takes what he wants and moves on, makes each one feel special. Then he's done. She had thought the women in the bathroom were talking about a stranger, someone who didn't match the man she knew, but the man she knew was standing in front of her, untangling himself from a kiss that had left her shaking, and the reason he was stopping wasn't honor or professionalism, it was her virginity. The realization hit her like cold water. He wanted her body. He had made that abundantly clear in the last 10 minutes. But a virgin was complicated. Her virgin came with expectations and consequences and emotional weight that a man who discarded women like used gauze wouldn't want to deal with. She was too much trouble. Not enough to keep, too much to use. The pain was extraordinary. She had never felt anything like it, a physical ache that started behind her ribs and spread outward through her chest until breathing became an act of conscious will. She had given this man her first kiss. She had sat on his lap and let him touch her skin, and made sounds she had never made in her life, and he was standing there, telling her it was a mistake. "You're right," she said. Her voice didn't waver. She was proud of that. It was a mistake, and it won't happen again. She turned and walked to the door. "Coleman—" She didn't stop. She opened the door, stepped through it, and closed it behind her with a force that rattled the frame. He stared at the closed door. The sound of it slamming echoed in the empty office, fading into a silence that felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. He had seen it. The moment the light left her eyes, the moment something inside her broke, and the warm, brilliant, courageous woman he had been kissing 30 seconds ago was replaced by someone cold and wounded and utterly unreachable. He pressed both hands against his desk and leaned forward, his head dropping between his shoulders. He had done the right thing. He was certain of it. He had never felt worse. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in controlled devastation. They moved through the hospital like 2 planets whose orbits had shifted just enough to ensure they never occupied the same space. She spoke to him only when a patient's care demanded it, her words stripped of everything except clinical necessity. He responded in kind, professional, efficient, hollow. The other residents noticed, the nurses noticed. Even the patients noticed, though they couldn't have explained what had changed. The air between Dr. Smith and Dr. Coleman had simply gone from charged to frozen, and everyone felt the temperature drop. Abigail lost weight. Not dramatically, but enough that her scrubs hung looser across her shoulders, and the bones at the base of her neck became more visible. She drank coffee instead of eating breakfast. She stayed later than anyone else, burying herself in work the way she had always buried herself in study, using productivity as a wall between herself and feeling. James was worse. His temper, always sharp, became serrated. He snapped at a second-year resident for a mistake so minor it barely qualified as an error. He cancelled 2 teaching sessions without explanation. The circles under his eyes deepened from shadows to bruises, and his coffee consumption doubled. 2 people drowning in the same building, in full view of everyone, and neither one reaching for the other. Both too proud, both too hurt, both completely, devastatingly in love. The corridor outside the radiology department had a water fountain that never worked properly. It dribbled instead of streamed, and using it required bending at an awkward angle that made everyone look slightly ridiculous. Abigail had stopped there out of habit, pressing the button with her thumb and waiting for the thin arc of water to reach her lips. "Hey, Coleman!" She straightened up. Ryan Torres was leaning against the opposite wall, arms loose at his sides, a grin already forming. He was 26, dark-haired, with an easy confidence that made him popular among the other residents. He laughed often, complained rarely, and had the kind of face that belonged on the brochure of a university that wanted to look approachable. He had been trying to talk to her for weeks. "Torres," she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Shouldn't you be in the ER?" "Shift ended 20 minutes ago. I'm a free man." He pushed off the wall and fell into step beside her. "Listen, I've been meaning to ask you something." She knew what was coming. She had noticed the signs, the way he lingered at her table during lunch, the extra beat of attention when they crossed paths during rounds. Ryan was kind, uncomplicated, and completely transparent in his interest. Under different circumstances, she might have appreciated it. "There's this Italian place on Elm Street," he said. "Tiny, family-owned, the kind of place where the owner remembers your name after one visit. I thought maybe we could grab dinner this weekend. Just casual. No pressure." She opened her mouth to say no, and then she saw James. He was coming around the corner at the far end of the corridor, chart in hand, walking with the purposeful stride she could identify from 100 feet away. He hadn't seen them yet. His eyes were on the file, but in 3 seconds he would look up, and he would see her standing here with Ryan Torres, and she wanted him to see. She hated herself for wanting it, but she wanted it anyway. "Sure," she said. "That sounds nice." Ryan's face lit up. "Yeah, great. I'll text you the details. Saturday work?" "Saturday works." James looked up. His eyes found them instantly, her and Ryan standing close, Ryan's body angled toward hers, with the unmistakable posture of a man who had just received good news. James's stride didn't change. His expression didn't shift. But something behind his eyes went very still, the way the surface of a lake goes still in the second before a stone breaks through. He reached them in 4 steps. "This is a hospital," he said. His voice was level, controlled. The kind of controlled that required effort. "Not a social club. Torres, don't you have patients to follow up on?" Ryan blinked. "My shift ended, Dr. Smith. I was just—" "Then go home and review your cases for tomorrow. Your differential on the Morrison patient was inadequate, and I expect a revised version on my desk by 7. Ryan's grin faded. He glanced at Abigail, a quick, confused look, and then nodded. "Yes, sir." He walked away without another word. The corridor was empty now. Just the 2 of them, and the broken water fountain, and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a low-grade headache. James turned to her. His jaw was set so tight she could see the muscles working beneath the skin. His eyes were dark, and the emotion in them was something she recognized but couldn't name, something that burned too hot to be professional concern and too fierce to be indifference. "My office," he said. "Now." She didn't argue. She didn't have the energy for a scene in the hallway, and part of her, the part she was trying very hard to silence, wanted to know what he would say behind a closed door. They walked in silence, side by side, half a step apart, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off his body like heat from an engine. His hand brushed hers once as they turned a corner, Neither of them acknowledged it. He held the door open. She walked in. He followed, closed the door behind them and turned the lock. The click echoed in the quiet room. She stood in the center of his office, arms crossed, chin raised. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, but her face was stone. She had spent 2 weeks building this wall, and she would not let him dismantle it with a locked door and a pair of dark eyes. "What do you want, Dr. Smith?" He stared at her. The chart was still in his hand. His knuckles were white around it. "You accepted his invitation." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, "I did." He dropped the chart on his desk. The sound was sharper than it should have been, paper and cardboard hitting wood with the force of something much heavier. "Why?" "Because he asked. Because I'm allowed to say yes. Because—" She uncrossed her arms and her hands balled into fists at her sides. "Because you don't get to tell me what was a mistake and then act like it matters who I have dinner with." He crossed the room in 3 steps. His mouth was on hers before she could finish the thought. He kissed her with fury, not the controlled, deliberate hunger of the first time or the tender ache of the second. This was raw. Jealousy and longing, and 2 weeks of sleepless nights poured into the pressure of his lips against hers, and she felt every single day of distance collapse between them like a building coming down. He pressed her against the wall. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her body flush against his, and she could feel the tension vibrating through him. A man at war with himself, losing badly, not caring anymore. She grabbed the front of his coat and pulled him closer, matching his intensity with her own because she was furious too. Furious at him for pushing her away. Furious at herself for still wanting him. Furious at the impossible, unbearable gravity of whatever this was between them. He broke the kiss. His forehead dropped against hers, both of them breathing hard, their chests heaving in tandem. "I can't do this anymore." His voice was wrecked, stripped down to something she had never heard from him, raw, unguarded, desperate. 2 weeks, Abigail, 2 weeks without your voice, without your eyes, without— He exhaled sharply. "I can't be near you without wanting to touch you. I can't be away from you without losing my mind. I need you. I need you, and I don't know how to make that fit inside the life I built, but I can't keep pretending it doesn't exist." Her eyes were burning. She wanted to fall into him, to let the words wash over her and carry her somewhere safe, but the nurse's voice was still there, lodged in her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. She pushed him back, one firm hand against his chest. He stepped away, surprised. "I'm not interested," she said, and her voice shook despite everything. "In being another name on your list." Confusion. Real, unfiltered confusion broke across his face. "What list?" "The women, the nurses, the ones you charm and use and throw away when you're done." The words tasted bitter, but she forced them out. "I heard about Jen from radiology, Lisa from the NICU, all the others. I know what you do, and I won't be part of it." He stared at her. For 3 full seconds he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then his expression changed. The confusion burned away, replaced by a fury so cold and so absolute that it transformed his entire face. Not directed at her, directed at something behind the words, at the source she hadn't named. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter who told you that, Abigail." "I overheard it. 2 nurses, in the bathroom." He turned away from her and pressed both hands flat against his desk, his head dropping forward. She watched the muscles in his back tense beneath his coat, watched his shoulders rise and fall with controlled, deliberate breaths. When he turned back, his voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. "Every word of that is a lie. I have never, and not once in 12 years, been involved with anyone in this hospital. No nurse, no doctor, no resident. No one." He stepped toward her. "There is no list. There is no Jen. There is no Lisa. Someone fed you a story designed to do exactly what it did." She searched his face for deception. She had spent weeks studying this man. His micro-expressions, his tells, the way his jaw tightened when he was holding back, and the way his eyes narrowed when something didn't add up. She knew his face better than she knew her own. There was no deception. "Think," he said. "Think about every interaction you've seen me have with another woman in this hospital. Every nurse, every doctor, every single person. Have I ever stood too close? Ever lingered? Ever looked at any of them the way I look at you? She thought. She replayed weeks of observation, his polite nods to the nursing staff, his brief handshakes with female colleagues, his clinical distance from everyone who wasn't a patient. And then she remembered the way he looked at her. Only her. The difference was so vast, so unmistakable, that she couldn't believe she hadn't seen it before. "Someone lied to me," she whispered. "Yes." He took her hand. His thumb traced a slow circle on her wrist. "And I intend to find out who." His thumb was still drawing circles on her wrist, small, slow, deliberate, as if he were writing something on her skin that only the two of them would ever be able to read. She could feel her pulse beating against his fingertip, and she knew he could feel it too. "I should have told you sooner," she said, "about what I heard, instead of just pulling away, and I should have fought harder to understand why you did." They stood in the middle of his office, the locked door behind them, the weight of 2 wasted weeks settling around their shoulders like dust after an earthquake. The anger was gone. The jealousy was gone. What remained was something quieter and more terrifying. The simple, undeniable truth of 2 people standing at the edge of something neither one could take back. He let go of her wrist. Not because he wanted to, but because what he was about to say required a kind of honesty that felt impossible while touching her. "These past 2 weeks broke something in me." He spoke slowly, choosing each word with the care of a man defusing a bomb. "I told myself I was doing the right thing, protecting your career, protecting mine. But every morning I walked into this hospital and looked for you, and every time you looked away it felt like something was being pulled out of my chest." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were shining. "I'm in love with you, Abigail." The words landed in the room like a held breath finally released. He said them without drama, without grand gestures. Just a man standing in his office at the end of a long day, telling the truth for the first time in weeks. "I don't know when it happened," he continued. "Maybe the first day when you raised your hand and answered a question no one else would touch. Maybe before that. Maybe the moment you walked through those doors and I couldn't look away." He exhaled. "But I know what it is now, and I'm done pretending it's something else." A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I've been in love with you since before I met you," she whispered. "Since your first lecture. Since you stood in front of 300 people and made medicine sound like the most important thing in the world." She laughed softly, a fragile, watery sound. "And then I got here, and you were terrible to me on the first day. And I thought I was an idiot for ever admiring you, but I couldn't stop. I tried, I really tried." He stepped closer. His hand found her cheek, his thumb catching the tear and brushing it away with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his reputation. "I want to be with you," he said. "Not in secret, not as a mistake. I want this to be real. The hospital. I'll handle the hospital. I'll talk to the board, request a transfer of supervision, do whatever needs to be done to make this work within the rules. But I need to know if you want this too." She covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm against her face. "Yes." He kissed her. Softly this time. A kiss that tasted like relief and beginning, and the particular sweetness of 2 people who had been fighting the same battle from opposite sides and had finally laid down their weapons. When they separated, she kept her hand on his chest. His heartbeat was steady now, calm, as if the simple act of telling the truth had settled something inside him that had been restless for a very long time. "There's something else," she said quietly. She looked at the collar of his coat instead of his eyes. "About what I told you about never having been with anyone. I remember. It wasn't just physical. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would wait until I was married, until I was with someone who chose me completely, not just for a night." She looked up, vulnerability in every line of her face. He held her gaze without flinching, without a trace of hesitation. "Then I'll wait. James, I'll wait for you, Abigail. A year, 5 years. However long it takes." His voice was steady, absolute, the voice of a man who had spent his entire life keeping promises and intended to keep this one too. "You're not a night, you're not a chapter, you're the whole story, and I'm not going anywhere." She buried her face in his chest. His arms closed around her, and for the first time in weeks, the butterflies in her stomach weren't made of anxiety. They were made of joy. 4 months changed everything and nothing. The hospital adjusted. James had spoken to the board within a week of their conversation, and Abigail's supervision was formally transferred to Dr. Patricia Voss, a cardiologist with 30 years of experience and a dry sense of humor that made even the worst shifts bearable. The transition was clean, professional, and left no room for whispers about favoritism. The whispers came anyway. They always do. But they faded quickly, because the truth was too boring to sustain gossip. 2 people who worked at the same hospital had fallen in love, and neither one's performance had suffered for it. Karen Mitchell requested a transfer to the night shift 3 weeks after the news became official. She never explained why. She didn't need to. Abigail and James built their relationship the way they built everything else, with precision, patience, and an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. He learned that she ate cereal for dinner when she was too tired to cook, and that she talked in her sleep during particularly stressful weeks. She learned that he ran 5 miles every morning before dawn, and that he kept a photograph of his late mother in his desk drawer, the framed picture she had glimpsed on her first visit to his office, but never seen clearly. They had dinner together on the nights their schedules aligned. He cooked. She was terrible at it, a fact she admitted with the cheerful honesty of someone who had spent 24 years choosing textbooks over recipes. "You burned water," he said one evening, staring at the blackened pot on her stove. The phone rang. "You burned water, Abigail. Are you going to keep repeating it, or are you going to order the pizza?" He ordered the pizza, and he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had never heard from him at the hospital. Deep and warm, it transformed his entire face. She stood in her tiny kitchen with a ruined pot and a smoke alarm that was still beeping, and thought that she would burn 1,000 pots to hear that sound again. He kept his promise. Every night ended at her door with a kiss that tested the limits of his self-control. Long, slow, devastating kisses that left them both breathless and wanting. And then he would press his forehead against hers, breathe deeply, and say goodnight. She could feel what it cost him, the restraint, the discipline, the way his hands trembled slightly against her waist when the kiss went on too long. It made her love him more, not less, because he wasn't waiting out of indifference. He was waiting because she had asked him to, and her request mattered more to him than his own desire. On a Tuesday evening in October, he took her to the hospital rooftop. She didn't know why. He had simply texted her to meet him there after her shift, and she had climbed the stairs expecting to find him with takeout containers and the tired smile he reserved for the end of long days. Instead, she found candles. Dozens of them, arranged in a wide circle on the concrete, their flames trembling in the autumn breeze. The sky above the city was purple and gold, the last light of the day bleeding into the first stars of the night. The air smelled of cooling asphalt and the faint sweetness of someone's garden 2 blocks away. He was standing in the center of the circle. No white coat, no hospital badge, just a man in a dark sweater with his hands in his pockets and an expression she had never seen him wear, nervous. James Smith, who stared down insurance companies and hospital boards without blinking, was nervous. "What is this?" she asked from the doorway. He pulled his right hand from his pocket. A small black box sat in his palm. Her breath stopped. He walked toward her, and with each step the composure he wore like a second skin fell away, piece by piece, until the man standing in front of her was stripped of every defense he had ever built. He knelt. "I spent 36 years thinking I didn't need anyone," he said. His voice was rough. "And then you walked into my hospital with shaking hands and answered a question no one else would try. And everything I thought I knew about myself stopped being true." He opened the box. A simple ring, a single stone that caught the candlelight and scattered it into tiny sparks. "Marry me, Abigail. Let me spend the rest of my life being the man you made me want to become." She knelt down in front of him, took his face in both hands, and kissed him. "Yes," she said against his mouth, 1,000 times. The church was small, white-clapboard walls, a wooden steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and stained glass windows that painted the floor in soft patches of color when the morning light came through. It sat at the end of a quiet street, lined with maple trees that had just begun to turn, gold and copper, and a deep burning red that made the whole block look like it was glowing from within. 43 people filled the pews. His side held colleagues who had become friends over a decade of shared trenches. Dr. Voss in the second row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she would later deny owning. Her side held her parents, an aunt who had driven 6 hours from Vermont, 3 friends from medical school, and Dorothy, the pneumonia patient from room 412, now fully recovered, and wearing a hat with silk flowers that she had bought specifically for the occasion. There were no bridesmaids in matching dresses, no string quartet, no ice sculptures or monogrammed napkins, just white flowers in mason jars at the end of each pew, and the scent of old wood and candle wax, and something sweet drifting in from the garden outside. Abigail's father walked her down the aisle. She wore ivory, a simple dress with long sleeves and a neckline that framed her collarbones, the fabric moving softly against her legs with each step. Her hair was down. He had never seen it down. It fell past her shoulders in loose waves that caught the colored light from the windows, and the sight of it knocked the breath out of him so completely that the best man had to touch his elbow to make sure he was still standing. She reached him. Her father placed her hand in his, and James's fingers closed around hers with a grip that said everything his face was too overwhelmed to express. The ceremony was short. Traditional vows spoken in steady voices that cracked in the same places. The promises, the forevers, the parts where the words became too large for the room and spilled over into silence. When the minister said he could kiss his bride, James cupped her face in both hands, looked at her for a long moment as if memorizing the exact way she looked right then, and kissed her with a tenderness that made Dorothy reach for her handkerchief and Dr. Voss give up pretending she wasn't crying. They drove to the hotel that evening, a coastal resort 2 hours south where the sound of the ocean reached every room and the salt air clung to the skin like a second layer of warmth. Their suite was on the top floor, wide windows facing the water, a private terrace with a pool that glowed turquoise in the fading light, and a bed covered in rose petals so deep red they looked almost black against the white sheets. Abigail stood in the doorway and pressed her hand against her chest. "You did all this?" "I had help." He set their bags down and came up behind her, his hands settling on her waist. His lips brushed her ear. "But the petals were my idea." She turned in his arms. The last light of the day came through the window and caught the side of her face, and he thought, not for the first time, not for the 100th, that he would never get used to looking at her. He kissed her slowly. No urgency, no stolen minutes between knocks on the door. They had all night, and he intended to use every second of it, making sure she felt nothing but safe. His hands found the zipper at the back of her dress. He paused, looked at her. "Tell me if you want me to stop. At any point. For any reason." She shook her head. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed, her fingers already working the buttons of his shirt. He undressed her the way he did everything that mattered, with patience and precision, and an attention so complete it bordered on devotion. He kissed her shoulders, her wrists, the hollow of her throat where her pulse fluttered beneath his lips. He mapped the landscape of her body with his mouth and his hands, learning her the way he had learned medicine, thoroughly, reverently, with the understanding that some knowledge is sacred. She trembled, not from fear, from the overwhelming sensation of being known, fully, completely, by someone whose hands were both strong enough to hold her and gentle enough to let her break. Afterward, she lay with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The ocean murmured outside the window. The rose petals were scattered across the floor. "Thank you," she whispered, "for waiting." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You were worth every second." 2 years later, the corridor outside the radiology department still had the same broken water fountain. Abigail passed it every morning and smiled. She smiled at the dent in the wall near the supply closet, where a gurney had collided during a chaotic night shift. She smiled at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, which had been fixed and broken and fixed again so many times that the maintenance crew had named it Frank. She smiled at the nurse's station where she had once stood with a crumpled printout and a cup of bad coffee, listening to strangers describe the man she would marry as cold and unreachable. The hospital was the same. She was not. Her white coat hung open over a soft grey sweater that stretched gently over the curve of her belly. 5 months. The bump was unmistakable now, round and firm, sitting low, the kind of shape that made strangers in elevators ask when she was due and whether she wanted a boy or a girl. A boy. They already knew. She turned the corner near the east wing, chart in one hand, the other resting on the side of her stomach the way it did now without her thinking about it. A constant, unconscious gesture of protection, as if her hand could feel the tiny heartbeat through skin and muscle and bone. He was coming from the opposite direction. James rounded the corner with his usual stride, long, purposeful, shoulders back, and stopped the moment he saw her. The transformation was instantaneous. The composed commanding chief of staff softened into something warmer, something that belonged only to her and to the small person growing between them. He smiled. Not the measured, professional acknowledgement he gave colleagues, not the reassuring calm he offered patients. A real smile, the kind that changed the shape of his eyes and erased years from his face and made her heart do the same ridiculous, wonderful thing it had been doing since the first day she saw him. She smiled back, wide and open and completely unguarded. Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith. The shared name still made her laugh. She had kept Coleman for her professional credentials, less confusing for the staff. But every time he called her by their married name, it felt like a private joke that belonged only to them. He took her hand and led her to his office, the same office where he had tested her on her first week, the same office where he had kissed her for the first time, the same armchair, the same desk, the same lock on the door which he turned with a familiar click. "I missed you," he said, pulling her close. She laughed. "You saw me an hour ago. 1 minute away from you is enough to make me miserable. An hour is unbearable." He kissed her. Gentle now but no less intent. His lips moved against hers with the quiet confidence of a man who had kissed this mouth 1,000 times and intended to kiss it 1,000 more. She tasted coffee and mint, and she felt his hand settle on the curve of her belly with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. He pulled back, looked at her for a moment, and then sank to his knees, both hands on either side of her stomach, his forehead resting against the stretched fabric of her sweater. She felt his breath, warm, steady, and then his voice, low and private, meant only for the three of them in this locked room. "Hey, William." His thumb traced a slow arc across the curve. "It's Dad. I just wanted you to know that your mother is the most beautiful woman in the world, and she's brilliant, and stubborn, and she burned water once, but we don't talk about that." Abigail laughed through the tears that had started falling without permission. He pressed his lips to her belly. Then he stood, lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and sat in the armchair with her cradled against his chest. Her head found the space between his neck and shoulder, the spot that fit her perfectly, that smelled like him, that felt like the safest place on earth. "You are the love of my life," he said against her hair. "The air I breathe. Every good thing I have started the day you walked through those doors with shaking hands and a white coat that was too big for you." She closed her eyes. Outside the office, the hospital hummed with its familiar rhythm. Footsteps, voices, the distant beep of monitors keeping watch over beating hearts. Inside, 2 people sat in a chair that had witnessed the beginning of everything, holding each other, holding their future, holding proof that some loves don't just survive the obstacles. They become stronger because of them. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.